In the autumn of 1492, three modest ships approached an island in what we now call the Bahamas, completing a journey across the Atlantic Ocean that had lasted just over 2 months. On board the largest vessel, the Santa Maria, stood a Genoese mariner named Cristoforo Colombo, known to history as Christopher Columbus. As his small fleet anchored offshore and he prepared to land on the island he would name San Salvador, Columbus could not have known that his arrival would initiate one of history's most profound transformations. The connecting of two worlds that had developed in isolation from each other for millennia. The story of Christopher Columbus is not simply the tale of a man who discovered America. Rather, it's a complex narrative of ambition, miscalculation, cultural collision, exploitation, and world-changing consequences, both intended and unintended. To understand Columbus, we must place him within his proper historical context while acknowledging the full scope of his actions and their lasting impact. Born around 1451 in Genoa, Italy, Columbus grew up in a thriving maritime republic with a long history of Mediterranean trade. Little is known with certainty about his early years, though his father was a wool weaver and merchant. Young Columbus appears to have had limited formal education, but developed practical knowledge through experience. By his early 20s, he had taken to the sea, participating in trading voyages throughout the Mediterranean and eventually venturing as far as the Atlantic islands controlled by Portugal and beyond to the British Isles. During this formative period, Columbus absorbed the navigational knowledge of his era. He learned to use a compass, read charts, gauge winds, and predict weather patterns. He studied the works of classical geographers and contemporary theorists, including Paolo Toscanelli, who suggested the possibility of reaching Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Columbus also witnessed Portugal's impressive maritime achievements under Prince Henry the Navigator and subsequent Portuguese kings, as their ships pushed southward along Africa's west coast in search of a sea route to Asia. The quest for direct access to Asian markets was a powerful economic driver in 15th-century Europe. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 had disrupted the traditional land routes that brought silks, spices, and other luxury goods from the east. Portugal was pioneering the southern route around Africa, but Columbus became convinced of an alternative: sailing west across the Atlantic to reach the eastern shores of Asia. Columbus's geographical conceptions, however, contained serious errors. Working from various calculations, including a misinterpretation of the 2nd century geographer Ptolemy, Columbus significantly underestimated the Earth's circumference and overestimated the eastward extension of Asia. He believed Japan lay approximately 3,000 miles west of the Canary Islands, less than half the actual distance. In reality, the American continents, unknown to Europeans, stood between Europe and Asia. By 1484, Columbus had developed his plan for a western voyage to Asia and sought backing from King John III of Portugal. After having the proposal evaluated by a committee of experts, the Portuguese monarch rejected it, correctly believing Columbus had underestimated the journey's length. Undeterred, Columbus turned his attention to the rising power of Spain, ruled by Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. Spain had recently completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula, with the conquest of Granada in January 1492. The Catholic monarchs, as Ferdinand and Isabella were known, were now looking to expand Spanish influence and compete with Portugal in overseas exploration. Nevertheless, Columbus's proposal was initially rejected by Spanish experts as well, who reached the same conclusions as their Portuguese counterparts about the flawed calculations. For nearly 7 years, Columbus lobbied intermittently at the Spanish court, while also sending his brother Bartholomew to seek support from the kings of England and France. His persistence finally paid off in 1492 when, perhaps influenced by court advisers who saw little harm in the speculative venture. Queen Isabella agreed to sponsor the expedition. The terms negotiated by Columbus were remarkably favorable. If successful, he would receive the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, be appointed governor of any lands he discovered, and receive 10% of all revenues from these territories. These terms reflect both Columbus's confidence and the Spanish monarch's low expectations. They were promising generous rewards for a success they considered unlikely. With royal backing secured, Columbus assembled his modest fleet in the port of Palos. The expedition consisted of 3 vessels: the Santa Maria, a larger carrack which served as the flagship, and 2 smaller caravels, the Pinta and the Nina. Contrary to popular misconception, the ships were not particularly small for their time. The Santa Maria was approximately 100 feet long, with a crew of 40, while each of the caravels carried about 25 men. The total expedition numbered around 90 sailors and officers. On August 3, 1492, Columbus's fleet departed from Palos, stopping briefly at the Canary Islands for repairs and provisioning, before setting out westward into the unknown Atlantic on September 6. The voyage was relatively smooth, with favorable winds speeding the ships along what became known as the trade winds route. Nevertheless, as weeks passed with no sight of land, the crews grew increasingly anxious. Some historical accounts suggest the men threatened mutiny, though contemporary scholarship suggests these stories may have been exaggerated in later retellings. On October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. Columbus and his men went ashore on an island in the Bahamas, which the local Taino people called Guanahani, and which Columbus renamed San Salvador, though the precise identity of this island remains debated by historians. There, they encountered the indigenous Taino, whom Columbus described in his journal with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and condescension. In his journal entry from October 12, Columbus wrote, "They should be good servants and of quick intelligence, since I see that they very soon say all that is said to them. And I believe that they would easily be made Christians, for it appeared to me that they had no religion." This passage reveals much about Columbus's worldview and foreshadows the exploitative relationship that would develop between Europeans and indigenous peoples. Columbus believed he had reached islands off the coast of East Asia, what Europeans called the Indies. Hence, he called the people he encountered Indians, a misnomer that persisted long after the geographical error was corrected. For the next several months, Columbus explored the islands of the Caribbean, including Cuba, which he believed might be mainland China, and Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. Throughout this exploration, Columbus sought evidence of the wealthy Asian civilizations described by Marco Polo, particularly sources of gold and spices. While he found some gold ornaments among the Taino, the quantities were modest. Nevertheless, he remained convinced that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, and that greater riches lay just beyond. On Hispaniola, Columbus established the settlement of La Navidad after the Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Eve 1492. Leaving about 40 men at this rudimentary outpost, he departed for Spain in January 1493 aboard the Nina, accompanied by the Pinta. Despite encountering severe storms during the return journey, both vessels reached Spain safely in March. Columbus's return was greeted with celebration and royal honors. He presented several Taino individuals, both willing and unwilling participants, exotic plants and animals, and gold items to the Spanish monarchs. Though the material wealth was less than hoped for, the prospect of newly discovered lands, which everyone still believed to be part of Asia, excited the Spanish crown. Columbus was confirmed in his titles and authorized to mount a much larger second expedition. The second voyage, which departed in September 1493, was of a different character than the first. With 17 ships and about 1,200 men, including priests, soldiers, and potential settlers. This was clearly a colonizing mission, rather than merely an exploratory one. Columbus brought European livestock, plants, and seeds, intending to establish permanent Spanish settlements. Upon returning to Hispaniola, Columbus discovered that La Navidad had been destroyed and all the Spaniards killed, apparently after they had antagonized the local Taino through demands for gold and women. Undeterred, Columbus established a new settlement, La Isabela, elsewhere on the island. He then continued his explorations, visiting more Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, and further sections of Cuba's coast, still believing he was navigating the waters of East Asia. The colony at La Isabela soon faced severe difficulties. Disease, food shortages, and conflicts with indigenous peoples created hardships. Moreover, most of the settlers were men unaccustomed to physical labor, having joined the expedition with dreams of effortless wealth rather than the demanding work of establishing a colony in a tropical environment. During this period, Columbus's treatment of both the colonists and the indigenous peoples grew increasingly harsh. He imposed strict discipline on the Spaniards, alienating many. More significantly, he implemented the encomienda system in Hispaniola, effectively enslaving the Taino population by requiring them to deliver regular quotas of gold or face severe punishment, including amputation of hands for those who failed to meet their quotas. In 1496, Columbus returned to Spain to defend his governance against complaints from disgruntled colonists. Though he maintained royal support, his prestige had diminished. His third voyage, beginning in 1498, took him farther south, where he encountered the coast of South America, near present-day Venezuela. The sight of a vast landmass and the fresh water flowing into the ocean from the Orinoco River should have suggested he had found a previously unknown continent, but Columbus instead theorized he had discovered the terrestrial paradise described in medieval geography. Meanwhile, conditions in Hispaniola had deteriorated further. Factional conflicts among the Spanish had erupted into open rebellion, while the indigenous population was being devastated by disease, warfare, enslavement, and suicide. When Columbus arrived at the main settlement of Santo Domingo, he found the colony in disarray. In 1500, the Spanish crown dispatched Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate the situation. Upon his arrival, Bobadilla was appalled by evidence of Columbus's brutal governance, including Spaniards who had been hanged for minor offenses. He arrested Columbus and his brothers, confiscated their property, and sent them back to Spain in chains. Though Columbus was quickly released upon his return and even had his property restored, he had lost his position as governor of the Indies. Nevertheless, he secured royal permission for a fourth and final voyage, which began in 1502. This expedition explored the coast of Central America, from Honduras to Panama, still searching for a passage to Asia. After being stranded for a year on Jamaica, due to shipworms destroying two of his vessels, Columbus finally returned to Spain in November 1504. The final 2 years of Columbus's life were marked by illness and efforts to reclaim the privileges and revenues he believed were his due under his original contract with the crown. Though still wealthy and titled, he felt his achievements had not been properly recognized. Columbus died in Valladolid, Spain, on May 20, 1506, still believing he had reached Asia rather than a new continent. Columbus never set foot on what would later become the United States of America. His explorations were limited to the Caribbean islands and portions of Central and South America. Nevertheless, his voyages initiated the sustained European engagement with the Americas that would transform both hemispheres. The immediate aftermath of Columbus's voyages saw Spain establish its colonial empire in the Caribbean and then expand to the American mainlands. Within decades, conquistadors like Hernan Cortés and Francisco Pizarro would overthrow the Aztec and Inca empires, sending unprecedented wealth flowing back to Spain and fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the consequences were catastrophic. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity, caused demographic collapse. Historians estimate that Hispaniola's population decreased from perhaps 1 million at the time of Columbus's arrival to just a few thousand by 1550. Similar patterns of depopulation occurred throughout the Americas. Beyond disease, European colonization brought warfare, enslavement, resource extraction, and cultural disruption to indigenous societies. The Spanish encomienda system that Columbus had implemented evolved into various forms of forced labor throughout the colonies. The exploitation of indigenous labor was later supplemented by the transatlantic slave trade, which brought millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas, adding another dimension to the Columbian legacy. At the same time, Columbus's voyages initiated what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, technologies, and ideas between the eastern and western hemispheres. European livestock like horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed American environments and economies. American crops like maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao revolutionized diets and agricultural systems worldwide. This biological exchange had profound and lasting impacts on global ecology, demography, and culture. Columbus's historical reputation has undergone significant reassessment over the centuries. In the United States, he was long celebrated as a heroic discoverer whose voyages exemplified courage, perseverance, and visionary thinking. The 400th anniversary of his first voyage in 1892 was marked by grand celebrations, and in 1937, Columbus Day became a federal holiday. However, in recent decades, greater attention to the perspectives of indigenous peoples and more critical historical analysis have led to a more complex and often more negative assessment of Columbus's legacy. Historians now emphasize his role in initiating European colonialism and the catastrophic consequences for Native Americans, as well as his personal participation in exploitation and slavery. This reassessment has been reflected in the renaming of Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day in many localities, the removal of Columbus statues, and heated debates about how his historical role should be taught and commemorated. These controversies reflect broader societal reckonings with historical injustices and evolving understandings of national identity. A balanced historical assessment recognizes both Columbus's genuine achievements as a navigator and the devastating consequences of his actions. From a navigational perspective, Columbus's first transatlantic voyage was a remarkable achievement that demonstrated exceptional seamanship, courage, and determination. Despite his geographical miscalculations, he successfully crossed the Atlantic and returned to report his findings, essentially opening the maritime route that would connect Europe to the Americas. At the same time, Columbus's treatment of indigenous peoples revealed the darker aspects of his character and the exploitative nature of European colonialism. His writings show he viewed indigenous peoples primarily as potential converts, laborers, and sources of profit, rather than as equals deserving of respect and autonomy. When appointed governor of Hispaniola, he established systems of forced labor that resulted in tremendous suffering and contributed to population collapse. Columbus was neither the superhuman hero of older American mythology nor the one-dimensional villain of some recent portrayals. He was a man of his time whose ambition, religious fervor, navigational skill, and commercial instincts combined to make him the agent of world-changing historical developments. His personal flaws, his arrogance, his brutality toward those he considered inferior, his obsession with finding gold, were magnified by the immense historical stage upon which he performed. The complexity of Columbus's legacy is perhaps best understood through the concept of historical contingency. Had Columbus not made his voyages, someone else would likely have crossed the Atlantic within the following decades as European maritime technology and economic incentives were trending in that direction. However, the specific timing, location, and character of Columbus's voyages shaped the particular colonial systems that developed in the Americas. The Spanish model of colonization that Columbus initiated, with its emphasis on extraction of precious metals, conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity, and establishment of hierarchical settler societies, differed from the later colonial approaches of powers like England, France, and the Netherlands. These differences had lasting implications for the social, economic, and political development of different regions in the Americas. Beyond these specific historical impacts, Columbus has acquired symbolic significance that transcends his actual voyages. For Italian Americans, he became a cultural hero whose achievements could be claimed with pride during periods of anti-Italian discrimination. For many Latin American nations, the Colombian encounter represents the beginning of their mestizo or mixed heritage, combining European and indigenous elements. For indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, Columbus symbolizes the beginning of centuries of dispossession, cultural destruction, and resistance. These competing symbolic meanings ensure that Columbus remains a contested figure in historical memory. Rather than attempting to reduce him to either hero or villain, a more productive approach acknowledges the full complexity of his legacy. The genuine achievement of establishing sustained contact between previously separate hemispheres, and the profound, often destructive consequences of that contact for the peoples and environments of the Americas. The story of Columbus also reveals important truths about historical processes more generally. It demonstrates how individual actions, even when based on mistaken premises, Columbus's geographical errors, can have world-changing consequences. It shows how technological developments, in this case, European shipbuilding and navigation, can enable new forms of cross-cultural contact with unpredictable results. And it illustrates how historical events that are celebrated by some groups can represent trauma and loss for others. In the 5 centuries since Columbus's voyages, the world he helped create has undergone further transformations. The colonial empires established by European powers eventually gave way to independent nations throughout the Americas. Indigenous peoples, despite suffering enormous losses, have maintained distinct cultural identities and are increasingly asserting their rights and perspectives. The global connections initiated by the Columbian voyages have intensified through centuries of migration, trade, cultural exchange, and now digital communication. Understanding Columbus in his full historical context, neither ignoring his genuine achievements nor minimizing the suffering his actions caused, helps us comprehend how the modern interconnected world came to be, with all its achievements and injustices. His voyages represent a pivotal moment when previously separate human worlds came into sustained contact, initiating processes of exchange, conflict, and transformation that continue to shape our global society. The legacy of Columbus reminds us that history is rarely simple. Events celebrated as discoveries or achievements by some may represent conquest and catastrophe for others. Historical figures can be simultaneously impressive in their accomplishments and deeply flawed in their moral judgments. And the consequences of historical actions often extend far beyond what the actors themselves could have imagined. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Columbus's voyages is that moments of cross-cultural contact carry immense potential for both creative exchange and destructive exploitation. How such contact unfolds depends not just on technological capabilities or economic incentives, but on the moral imagination and ethical choices of those involved. In this sense, the Columbian legacy continues to challenge us. Can we create forms of global connection that foster mutual benefit rather than domination, and that respect the dignity and rights of all peoples? As we continue to navigate our increasingly interconnected world, the story of Christopher Columbus, with all its complexity, achievement, and tragedy, remains not just a chapter of history, but a still unfolding narrative about humanity's capacity for exploration, exploitation, and eventually, perhaps, more equitable forms of exchange. The world Columbus helped create is still very much in the making, and understanding his legacy helps us comprehend both how we arrived at our present moment and the challenges we face in creating a more just global future.